Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
You're probably tired of the word tariff. Well, guess what? This issue is not going away anytime soon. The U.S. has already delayed tariffs on Canadian goods, and now there's an exemption for the auto sector. This story is also very fluid, with big potential implications for the Canadian economy and the Canadian consumer. And this situation in particular is very, very different, according to one expert. I'm Kris McCusker, and on this episode of The Big Story, we speak to Joy Nott, Partner, National Tax, Trade and Customs at KPMG Canada. Thanks for doing this. I know you've had a busy few days.
To say the least.
So how do you see this situation? I feel like unusual might be an understatement.
It's definitely unusual. I mean, I've been doing customs and international trade now for about 40 years. And so I remember when NAFTA was being negotiated. I mean, I've been around for that long. And normally when you're talking about changing the rules of international trade, there's usually a lot of negotiations that go back and forth. Documents are written, they're edited, they go back and forth. You know, there's time for public consultation. Everybody squints at it, looks at it, gives their 2 cents worth, and then written documents get revised and so on. None of that's happening in this particular environment. So it's highly unusual in that regard. And that international trade doesn't usually move at this speed and with this level of rapid change. This is very unusual.
It's volatile.
I would agree. It's certainly never before in my career have I felt that if I didn't check the news every 15 minutes, that I would be out of touch. And now that's sort of the feeling that I get. I need to be constantly plugged in because you never know. Things can change moment to moment and materially change, not just small changes around the edges, materially change in just a matter of a few minutes.
Well, and that's worth highlighting here. I mean, you and I are speaking Wednesday afternoon, and it's possible that the discussion that we have today could be out of date by the same time tomorrow.
You're absolutely right. So yesterday we heard it was 25%. We know that it was 25%. Tariffs that are applied against all goods Canadian entering the United States. And now today it's been confirmed by the White House press secretary that automotive parts and the automotive industry basically is getting a reprieve for another 30 days, where as long as the automotive parts and or the vehicles qualify for the free trade agreement, in Canada we call it CUSMA, in the United States they call it USMCA, in Mexico it's TMEC, it's all the same agreement. As long as everything qualifies for that, for the next 30 days, there won't be any tariffs applied. But then we still don't have any clarity what's going to happen 31 days from now, because it's not a permanent solution. It's a 30-day reprieve for the automotive industry.
And the White House spokesperson also said that the U.S. president is open to other exemptions. So this, again, subject to change.
Exactly. And I mean, there are so many industry sectors, because the nature of the tariffs against Canada and Mexico, for that matter, are on all goods, Canadian or Mexican. I mean, that just impacts literally so many industry sectors. There's too many to name in a conversation like this. It literally impacts everyone, including companies that offer services that normally would not be impacted by tariff. But they are being impacted by tariffs right now. Like, just as an example, if you'll just indulge me for a second, I've been talking to insurance companies, and you think, insurance companies? What do insurance companies have to do with tariffs? Well, the next time you bump your bumper or, have a fender bender and you have to make an insurance claim and they're paying for automotive parts to fix your bumper or your fender, and automotive parts right now, like I just finished saying, we're in a 30-day reprieve. But let's go back in time a few hours, and there was 25% tariffs on automotive parts every time they crossed the border into the States, and those tariffs stuck every time they crossed into the States. It was 25% each time, with no ability to get a refund for the previous time that you were in. So think about what that does to the price of a fender or to the price of a bumper for the insurance company. And then they look at the premiums they're charging, and then they look at the outlay that they might have to have on car parts. And suddenly the math doesn't necessarily work. So I've been having some really interesting conversations with industry sectors that, to be honest, I would not have thought about a few months ago being impacted by the tariffs, but this is just sort of highlighting how much these tariffs are disrupting Canadian industry in all kinds of different industry sectors. It's widespread.
You also spoke about the free trade deal. Some people might be confused. Like, isn't a trade deal supposed to eliminate the need for tariffs?
Absolutely. That's why they're negotiated. And right now, the free trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico still exists. It's still a law on the books in all three countries. The tariffs that the United States has applied are applied under a piece of legislation called IEEPA, the International Emergencies Economic Powers Act. And what happened was the president declared a national emergency on fentanyl and illegal immigration on both the southern and northern borders, two separate executive orders. And what that piece of legislation gave him the ability to do was to put tariffs, emergency tariffs on, despite the fact we have a free trade agreement. So the free trade agreement is still sitting there beneath these tariffs. And in fact, Canada has now, it's my understanding that we've made an appeal to the World Trade Organization about these tariffs, and the fact that these tariffs have been applied, we're saying is a breach of that free trade agreement, because the free trade agreement basically said that there was nothing that would stop a country, any of the three countries who was having a national emergency, could do what they thought they needed to do to safeguard their country, including putting tariffs on. But I think Canada's position is that what's happening right now goes against the spirit of what was initially negotiated. So again, if you'll indulge me, just another example of that, the steel and aluminum tariffs, which are set to take place on March 12th, next week's drama. The last time in 2018, 2019, when steel and aluminum tariffs were applied against Canada, after about a year, Canada managed to negotiate them away. We negotiated an exemption. We didn't get rid of them. We got an exemption for ourselves, and there's a difference there. So that exemption that applied against Canada is now what's going to be removed potentially on March 12th. And when we were negotiating that exemption, we had a side letter. And what that side letter said as part of so you have the free trade agreement, and then next to the free trade agreement, we had this, if you want to think of it like an appendix, a side letter. And in that side letter, it said that the U.S. would not apply additional steel and aluminum tariffs against Canada until a 60-day consultation period had been undertaken. So if the U.S. decided it wanted to start charging steel and aluminum tariffs again, it would have to go into negotiations for a minimum of 60 days with Canada before it could actually apply the tariffs. But I mean, that's not what's happening in this particular circumstance. So, again, I don't know. I have not personally looked at the WTO complaint that Canada lodged. So I maybe that's part of it as well. I don't know. So I can't really comment further on that. But I know that side letter exists. I've read it many times. I read it in 2019 very carefully to see what it said. Technically, it's still there, but there's no 60-day consultation period that's taking place that I'm aware of.
Everything you've outlined, and this is a reminder for everyone, this was all negotiated during Donald Trump's first term.
Absolutely. This was done under the first Trump administration. 2018, 2019 is the timeline that we're talking about. And he was the president of the United States at the time. And he was also the president that signed the free trade agreement that we currently are using. It was done under his administration as well. All of this was done under his administration. The side letter, the free trade agreement.
So he's moving the goalposts.
It would seem that way. I think that it's 4 years later, and I think that he has a very different view right now of international trade and how international trade can be used as a much more powerful tool than I think he thought about during his first administration. During his first administration, it was definitely part of his plan. I mean, he did apply steel and aluminum tariffs against Canada, and there were things that were done from an international trade perspective. But it seems that this time round, international trade is in the center of his policy agenda. It's not on the fringes, it's in the center of it. A lot of problems seem to be being addressed with applying a tariff against it.
The way it's being discussed as well is, I find, confusing because, I mean, there are so many things to fact check. So we could be here for hours if we went through it point by point. But the big overarching theme to me is that this is not only going to be bad for the Canadian economy, but it is going to be bad for the US economy too. Not quite to the same extent, but still a problem. And this is years after both countries have worked so hard to beat back inflation. And then along come these tariffs that could result in a spike.
I'm not an economist, but every economist report that I've read has very clearly said that tariffs definitely add to an inflationary trend. If you have tariffs, inflation is likely to rise from as a direct result of the tariffs. So while I'm not an economist, I can see the direct cause and effect. Tariffs equal things being more expensive. I get it. It's a direct line. And when you say things, not being clear, I just finished explaining that the current tariffs that we're talking about were the 25% on everything tariffs were under a piece of legislation called IEEPA, and it was because of a national emergency for fentanyl and illegal immigrants entering the United States from Canada on the northern border. But then in some of the press releases and in some of the things that have happened, there have been comments made by this administration to say, if you want to avoid the tariffs, build your factories in the United States. Well, I thought the tariffs were because of fentanyl and illegal immigration, not because the factories are in Canada. So there's been mixed messaging that's come out, inconsistent messaging. I mean, the legal language that's in the executive order, of course, has remained stable, but the verbal comments around it have been changing, and they're not consistent with what's in writing, which that again, given what I do for a living, normally what's in writing and what bureaucrats and politicians talk about after it's put in writing, usually there's not a lot of sunlight between those two things. And unfortunately, this time, what the written word is and what's being spoken, sometimes they don't align, and it is confusing.
I've often said about everything in life that human beings can deal with whatever is happening as long as they know what they're dealing with. But if it keeps changing or it's, thrown out there kind of haphazard, it's very hard to cope.
Well, one of the things that I do for a living is I've been helping companies model, so think of spreadsheets, financial modeling of the tariffs and their particular business numbers, and what I'm trying to help them do is mitigate the tariff. In most cases, I cannot eliminate the tariffs for them, but I can certainly help them come up with strategies to minimize the amount of tariffs that they're paying. That's what I do for a living. And in this tariff modeling, I mean, sometimes it gets really hard because you're trying to come up with models, right, that you plug numbers into, but then the fact pattern keeps changing so that you keep having to change your model because the fact patterns keep changing. So your model is forever changing, which that again, highly unusual. I mean, normally you look at a particular situation and you look at the factors of that situation and you build a model around it, and then you just plug numbers in and then play with the numbers to see what happens to the results at the bottom. In this particular case, the factors keep changing, so it makes modeling at times really hard. And that high level of uncertainty makes it really difficult for companies to make solid decisions with any real sense of confidence, because usually, they'll make the best decision that they can make with the information they have in front of them. But compared to what they normally have in front of them and their normal ability to make a decision based on facts compared to what we're dealing with today is very different. Companies, this is when the true entrepreneurial spirit of Canadian companies has to rise to the top, because, making important decisions and taking educated risks in order to do what you think is best for your company is what's required in these times. And that, I think, is bringing the true entrepreneurialism of Canadian business to the surface.
KPMG has recently done a survey, this data really fresh, showing that 2/3 of Canadian companies can withstand a tariff war that lasts more than a year. That to me was a little bit surprising. Was it to you?
I'm going to say yes to that, but it's not like I didn't find it shocking, because I think for a lot of Canadian companies, from a business perspective, knowing that this administration was coming back again after winning the election in November, there was sort of a bit of a runway and for people to start thinking that this could potentially happen, because all during the campaign in the United States, the current president made it very clear that tariffs were a big part of his policy. He talked about it openly. So if you were paying attention during the campaigning, you knew that this was coming. And for a lot of Canadian companies, I think they're sitting on piles of cash. I'm not saying huge piles of cash, but I think that they had cash reserves. So I think they're looking at it now, and we've learned some lessons because of COVID-19. This is not the same fact pattern as COVID-19, but it sort of is, in that we're facing something unprecedented and, high levels of uncertainty. So a lot of the same strategies that were deployed during COVID are being brought to the front here. So it's not really surprising to me that 2/3 say that they could withstand it, it's some sort of trade war that lasted a year or more. And what I was really happy to hear was that it was only a very tiny percentage that said that they couldn't survive it. It was a tiny percentage. It was like 3%.
Just to underline this, like they could withstand it, but it wouldn't be good for business.
Oh no, it's going to be painful. I mean, it's like this isn't going to be good for anybody. I mean, there's no way there'll be losses in the system, but I think what these companies are trying to say is that they can withstand the losses. They can't withstand them forever, but could they withstand them for a year of sustained pressure? And then after a year, I think things might start to look a little bit different. But for a year, could they sustain tariffs, and could they sustain repetitive losses month over month for a year? They're saying that, yeah, they could.
Small business, medium-sized businesses, this is the heart of the Canadian economy.
For sure. I mean, you're absolutely right that compared to, other nations around the world, Canada, the heartbeat, as you just finished saying, the heartbeat of Canadian business is small to medium-sized businesses compared to other countries that have, enormous companies that are headquartered in their countries. Canada has a few of those, but not all that many. But small to medium-sized business is the heartbeat of Canada. And, I think there's a couple of things that we heard them say. We heard them say that 2/3 of them could survive a trade war for at least a year. We also heard them say that a very high percentage of them said that they wanted to, like in the high 80 percentile, said that they expected all three levels of government to step up and to, cut the red tape, cut through the noise, and to do what they needed to do at their various levels of government to assist the economy as we go through this challenge together. Because it's 25% across the board, the tariffs that are currently in place with the United States, it's literally all of us. So it's that we need to all get on the same page, and they made it very clear that they expect all three levels of government to step up and assist.
Okay, well, more to come on this. I feel like this story isn't over yet.
No, it isn't over. And if I can just make one more point.
Absolutely.
I mean, so a lot of people are paying attention to the tariff that went on yesterday, the 25% across everything, for obvious reasons. People are also somewhat alert to the steel and aluminum tariffs that are set to start on March 12th. For obvious reasons, but not a lot of people are talking about the reciprocal tariffs that are set to start on April 2nd. And those are the tariffs that I watch. They're the quiet ones that nobody's talking about right now, but those are the tariffs that I think if they get applied, they will stick for the long term. The tariffs that we're talking about today, which have such a huge effect on everyone all at the same time, I don't know what the longevity of these tariffs are. I don't know if they're around for the long term or the short term, but it's those April 2nd tariffs that I'm keeping my eye on, because those are the quiet ones that you'll have a lot of research will have gone into the recommendations that are made to the White House on exactly what to do relative to reciprocal tariffs, which countries should get which reciprocal tariff, and what that looks like. I don't have more details than that right now than that because they haven't released anything, but those are the tariffs that I think that once they're applied, there won't be negotiating those 30 days away. I think those will be, they'll hit and they'll stick. I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong, but those are the ones I'm watching.
Thank you so much for your time on this. Your expertise is very much appreciated.
Well, thank you for having me, Kris.
Join Nott as partner National Tax, Trade, and Customs at KPMG Canada. You can find more at kpmg.com/ca. That wraps up this episode of The Big Story. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Kris McCusker. Thanks for listening.